Welcome to a special episode of Coffee and Conflict, a National Security Institute podcast where I sit down with leading authors and experts to discuss some of the most recent works in the bigger picture of national security, foreign policy, and intelligence issues. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at the National Security Institute and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. I'm honored and privileged today to welcome Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. General McMaster served in the U.S. Army for 34 years, retiring in June 2018 after serving as Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Prior to that position, while in uniform, he served as Director of Army Capabilities Integration Center and the Deputy Commanding General Futures of U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command and Commanding General of Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning. He has commanded organizations in wartime, including Combined Joint Interagency Task Force Afghanistan, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq, and Eagle Troop's 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Operation Desert Storm. He holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is the author of best-selling books Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Lies That Led to Vietnam, of which I'm pleased to say I actually have a signed copy at home. And in August 2004, General McMaster released his most recent book, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. Today, General McMaster is Dafoud and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, from where he joins us today. General
Hey, Joshua, it's
McMaster,
great
thank
to be
you
with you.
so
Thanks
much
for
for
having me.
joining us today. There is so much to talk about, and I want to maximize your available time, but I really want to start out, if I may, with a big strategic picture question. We've heard a lot about the axis of upheaval. We've heard about the rise of the CRINCs, which is, I think, a terrible acronym, Cold War 2.0. But when you look at the world today, how do you characterize the geopolitical landscape? What is
I
your
think we are
framing of reference
facing
for
an
where we're
axis
at
of
right now?
aggressors, and that axis of aggressors is led by two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia, and they have brought into the fold, North Korea and Iran. And of course, each of these countries has their own objectives, but what they can agree on and what they're working toward is to essentially tear down the existing rules of international discourse and replace them with a new set of rules that is sympathetic to their authoritarian forms of government, and in China's case in particular, its statist, mercantilist economic model. And what we have seen is as this axis has coalesced, I think, in the last 4 years, largely because of the perception of weakness in the West broadly, and that perception was, I think, made clear by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping when they issued their joint statement just prior to the Beijing Olympics in early 2022, in which they talked about their partnership with no limits, but then talked about a new era of international relations. And of course, the message to the West was, hey, you're done. We're in charge now. Get used to it. And they've reinforced that message, consistently since then, talking about, and from Xi Jinping's terms, changes we have not seen in 100 years. And the world is in chaos, and his belief that chaos is in their favor. And he turns to Putin and says, Vladimir, these changes are in our favor. So I think, they've been quite clear about what they're saying, but it's really important to pay attention to what they're doing. And what you have is, of course, Russia continuing its onslaught against the Ukrainians, but waging a broader shadow war against Europe and the West in an effort to tear apart NATO, to rend the transatlantic relationship. And who's underwriting that effort? It's China, with purchases of Russian oil and gas to feed Putin's ATM that he needs to sustain this shadow war and the war against Ukraine, as well as the hardware and equipment necessary to feed his war-making machine there and to generate the weapons that they continue to use against Ukraine. And then, you have also, North Korean soldiers, fighting alongside Russians in the first major land war in Europe since World War II. You have the North Koreans also providing, probably 6 million to 8 million artillery rounds and missiles to the Russians. You have Iran, providing Shahed drones and support for the Russians, and of course, you have China supporting both North Korea, but especially Iran, and China's buying 97% of Iran's oil, for example. So you have, lots of evidence in terms of not just what they say, but what they're doing. When you have Houthis firing Iranian missiles at shipping, including U.S. naval vessels in the Bab el-Mandeb, and doing it because they're being fed with Russian intelligence. I mean, the list can go on and on about the degree to which they're aiding and abetting one another, and they're aiding and abetting one another diplomatically in the information sphere. So, yeah, I would call it the axis of aggressors, and I would say that what has allowed them to coalesce, or incentivized them to coalesce, is the perception of weakness in the West, which I think that statement I mentioned in early 22, you can draw a direct line from the disastrous kind of self-defeat in Afghanistan and humiliating withdrawal there to that statement and this aggressive action that we've seen.
If I could stick with this for a moment, I'm curious. I mean, do you see, based on what Russia and China's alignment of convenience and sort of tactical interest, they have basically put out an idea of sort of the return to a multipolar world. It was the language that Secretary Rubio used recently in an interview. Do you see that the direction in which we are headed back to not necessarily a unipolar moment, but a much more competitive dynamic between a Western rules-based order and then
Well,
the
I
axis
think
of
that's been
aggression, as you
apparent for
highlighted?
quite some time, that we are dealing with these revanchist, revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass. And I think that argument was made quite clear in an excellent book by Wes Mitchell and Jakob Griegel called Unquiet Frontier, I think, which came out around 2016, if I remember. And it was reflected in President Trump's national security strategy that was published in December of 2017. I think we had known it for a while, but we were in denial about the nature of this competition because we had bought into some fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War world, right? The first of which was that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Related to that was an assumption that great power competition and rivalry was a relic of the past, right? We were going to have this condominium of nations emerge in which we would work together on global issues, and do so within international organizations. And then the third assumption that we made was that, our military prowess, our technological military prowess, would guarantee our security well into the future. And even though there were many warning signs that great power competition was returning, whether it was China's failure to adhere to the rules of international economic discourse once it entered the World Trade Organization, and it's engaging in a broad range of economic aggression and a massive buildup of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and Navy and Air Force, of course, included in that, and then also Russia. I mean, Russia's behavior after Putin takes over in the year 2000. Remember, he's been in power for a quarter century, and he builds up power and then begins to subvert Europe, to subvert Ukraine, poisoning, remember, a presidential candidate in Ukraine in 2003, and announcing kind of his grievances and his intentions in the Munich speech in 2007, around the time of the massive cyber attacks and incitement of riots in Estonia and in the Baltic states in that same year, invasion of Georgia 2008. I mean, you can just go on and on, right? And so we should have known that great power competition was returning because it was, but we were in denial about it. And what did we continue to do? We continued to withdraw from Europe in the face of Russian aggression. We removed all of our tanks. I've got an affinity for tanks, and they and despite what was happening in Europe, we kept reducing our defense budgets, even though we were at war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and we were sending like really all the wrong signals to these adversaries. And then, of course, we suffered some blows ourselves, right? The unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, financial crisis, 2008, 2009, toss in an opioid epidemic. Look at the effect of social media on our confidence in our democratic principles, institutions, and processes, and in our, sort of in our common identity as Americans. Look at the interaction of identity politics and various reified philosophies associated with new left or postmodernist and various critical theories interacting with old forms of bigotry and racism, and the degree to which we're pulling ourselves apart through that kind of interaction. So I think our adversaries were looking at us and saying, hey, they're finished. And that's the message they've been saying to their own people, really. If you look at any Chinese, media oriented on the Chinese people, the state television, it's, hey, here's all the great stuff the party's doing and Xi Jinping's doing for you, followed by, the aspiration of the China dream and the vision of national rejuvenation, followed by, hey, the West is trying to keep you down, and by the way, the West is decadent and a failing civilization. So I think we have to recognize the nature of this competition and regain kind of our confidence and we should be confident. Maybe Josh, we could talk more about the weaknesses in this axis of aggressors, but they look strong from the outside, but I think actually they're quite brittle and weak at the moment.
Mhm. Well, it's actually a great segue. Because the deniability aspect of this, I think, was seen quite clearly in European defense and security policy up until very recently. Certainly, President Trump's remarks and sort of accelerating the rearmament efforts and force generation capacity of Europe. But looking at the question with Russia, I think it's probably a good point to start at. The president is determined to bring this war to an end. I think he's due to speak President Putin today. He may actually be speaking with him right now. Can the president achieve his goals of ending the war in Ukraine that will lead to a sort of stable and secure Ukraine and de-risk the relationship with Russia? I mean, how do we avoid ending up at a Minsk III situation, repeating the failures of Minsk I and II from your perspective? I mean, I remember reading Battlegrounds, you talking about the dynamic with Russia.
Well,
Would love your thoughts on
President
that.
Trump can, I think, incentivize Russia to get to an agreement that's acceptable to the Ukrainians and can provide, an enduring peace, but also with the objective in mind, which I'd like to hear people talk more about, of a sovereign, secure, prosperous Ukraine, right? That can defend itself, that can prevent Russia from ever again challenging its sovereignty, and then maybe even have the promise of working over time to regain any territory that was temporarily lost, to the Russians. What he'll have to do is disabuse himself of this idea that Putin is somehow aggrieved, and it's because of Putin's lack of security that he lashed out against Ukraine. This is, of course, the Russian narrative. But what's really important to recognize about Putin is that he has aspirations in mind that go far beyond anything in relation to what the United States, NATO, or anybody else does. He really does want to reestablish kind of a new Russian empire because he is a man obsessed with restoring Russia to national greatness. He's obsessed because of his sense of honor lost associated with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the loss of the Cold War. And so the sooner that we recognize, that everybody recognizes that Putin has these aspirations, then we'll recognize that he has to actually be physically stopped. And and of course, what he's going to try to do with President Trump is offload responsibility for the war, which he's had a degree of success in already based on the president's public statements. Create this kind of sense of mutual agreement with President Trump. Boy, Donald, you've been treated so unfairly. So have I. We're in this together. I mean, try to create like we're in it together. Then what he'll do is after then offloading responsibility for the war, try to hold out the prospect of, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could work together, and solve some of the world's problems? We have so many nuclear weapons. We should reduce nuclear weapons and the danger. And so President Trump's desire to have some kind of an entente with Putin is not really like nefarious. It's not like he's not bad intentioned. But Putin doesn't want to, is not going to deliver on any of that.
Mhm.
It's just a way to manipulate President Trump, just like he's
Right.
manipulated every previous American president since he's come in. Remember, George W. Bush looked into his soul, saw a man who cared about his people. President Obama had the reset policy. This is after the invasion of Georgia, brought and Hillary Clinton brought the reset button to that odious man Lavrov in, in Geneva, thinking they were going to make progress. Really, and President Obama leaned over to Medvedev, remember, as he was keeping the seat warm for Putin, and said, "I'll have more
Mhm.
flexibility after I'm reelected," and then we traded off missile defenses for Poland in exchange for maybe a better relationship with Putin. I mean, how long are we going to get strung along? And then you had President Trump operated under this illusion for part of his presidency, even though he did impose significant costs on Russia after a number of aggressive actions by Russia, the Skripal poisoning, in particular, he provided javelins, to the Ukrainians, despite this kind of narrative of, that would indicate some kind of
Mhm.
affinity toward Putin. President Biden, not to be left out, right? He goes to Geneva, lays out all of his red lines, which for Putin sounds like green lights for everything else. He lists all the things he won't do to support Ukraine. He pulls our vessels out of the Black Sea. He evacuates all of our advisors out of Ukraine, evacuates our embassy and scuttles our embassy, right? And so all that did is embolden Putin, obviously. And so, hey, let's stop this, right? Angela Merkel, right? Remember, she was the Putin whisperer. She was going to bind him to Europe's economy with Nord Stream 2, and uh and Macron was going to be the one to
Yep.
convince. I mean, come on, how many episodes of serial gullibility are we going to just watch, without calling Putin out on it? So what I think what's going to happen here is, Putin's going to try to pocket any concessions he can get from President Trump, and then he'll remain intransigent. President Trump will realize it, and I think ultimately come to the conclusion, that it's now important to put more pressure on Putin, who's in a profoundly weak position, I should say. I mean, the Russians have taken, about
Mhm.
45% of their casualties in the war. They've suffered in 2024 and into 2025, right? So, Putin his economy is in a really, he's desperate. He's spending 47% equivalent of GDP on defense. He's sitting on piles of cash that he can't convert. He's got, inflation at about 30%. He has a labor shortage. He's in a very difficult position. And, what I would like to have seen, I think President Trump missed this opportunity, would be to sort of affirm the long-term support for Ukraine and put the pressure on Putin up front. He's taken a different approach, which is okay. I mean, we'll see how it works out. But I think ultimately President Trump will be disappointed, and Putin will remain Vladimir Putin. And I think, hey, it's also important to realize he's waging this broader war, the shadow war, against Europe, and his ambitions are grander, right? To rend the transatlantic relationship, to break Europe apart. Joshua, you're doing a lot of work in this area, and I think we all anxiously await your book on the topic of the transatlantic relationship. I mean, you may have to do. I know you're doing some revisions now based on what's happened, but I mean, it's an important area of focus. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But I think Putin's pretty happy at the moment, because he sees, strains in the transatlantic relationship. Um, but I think that ultimately he's going to be disappointed because I think President Trump will recognize the threat that Vladimir Putin still continues to pose, and I hope that there's a moment like he had in Hanoi with Kim Jong Un in the second summit where he just walked out. I think he's going to come to that
Mhm.
conclusion.
I think it's very interesting. And you raise a point that highlights the fact that President Trump does, he wants a deal, but he wants a good deal. The only thing worse than no deal is probably a bad deal, I think, in the president's mind for this. Um, and it's also interesting that you highlight about the differing zones of conception of competition and conflict with Russia and the United States. I mean, going back to George W. Bush, the first phone call after 9/11, if I'm not mistaken, was President Putin to President Bush, and then this aid that came thereafter, and the attempts of successive administrations to merge to improve the relationship. I think is probably the best way to describe it. So I'm looking at it from those perspectives, and given your time in the White House, is it just fated to have fundamental friction? Obviously, Russia's grandeur ambitions, as you highlighted, sort of the imperial future for what President Putin wants, the United States' vision of a rules-based international order. Are we destined to have conflict or friction, or is there potential area for future improvement of relations under, say, President Putin,
I
but
would
then
say
also
that under
post-President
President
Putin?
Putin, probably not, right? Unless he concludes that he's in such a desperate situation that he has to alter his behavior in terms of the shadow war, which I mentioned, which of course includes, the cutting of undersea cables, cyber attacks,
Mhm.
assassinations, right? The burning down of warehouses,
The burning of IKEA.
absolutely, the attacks on infrastructure. But also, you're pointing out something very important, that it's just not the European theater. He wants to, of course, subvert European countries like he's done in Romania, like he's trying to do in Bulgaria, like he tried to do it in Moldova. um, like he's doing further afield from Europe and Georgia, what he's done in Slovakia, for example, or and the using cultivating Orban as a useful idiot for the Kremlin. So all of this is this is part of an overall campaign. He wants to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake, but also what he's done is try to extend Russian influence into the Middle East. Of course, that's failed. That endeavor's failed as he enabled the serial episodes of mass homicide in the Syrian civil war. But with the collapse of Hezbollah, which he was really mainly relying on more than Russian capabilities, Assad was relying on. He's had to run away from Syria and can no longer pose as both the arsonist and the fireman in the Middle East. But of course, he's moved to Libya, right? And he's fomented coups in the Sahel, and is involved in extracting as much gold there, and other commodities in kind of a new form of colonialism that he's trying to impose on those countries through the Wagner Group, and his support for military coups in those countries. So, Putin's not going away, unless he's stopped. He has to be physically stopped, I believe. And you can only do that by, I think, imposing costs on him that go far beyond the cost that he factors in when he commits these acts of aggression. He's the best liar in the world, right? He's the best deceiver in the world, and his playbook is to flatter leaders. Hey, you're the only person who could come to a deal with me. And then what he'll do is, he'll try to create this again sense of aggrievement. Look at how I've been treated. We've been treated so unfairly. And he'll blame others for his own acts of aggression. And then what he'll do is hold out the prospect of a big deal. You mentioned after 9/11, working together on counterterrorism, right? He still was playing that card in 2017, 2018, which was code for supporting Assad's effort to continue mass murder against Sunni Arab communities inside of Syria. So wouldn't it be great, if we could reduce nuclear weapons, as I mentioned? Wouldn't it be great if we invested in each other's economies? So many great opportunities, President Trump or Donald, for investment in Russia. A lot of Americans can make a lot of money over here. So he strings people along with these false promises of cooperation and mutual benefit. He's a KGB operator, but also I think he is this combination of a street thug and bully and a coward at the same time. I mean, the Biden administration fell into the trap of, trying to de-escalate or manage escalation with Putin, and meeting out assistance, and then, President Biden kept talking about like preventing World War III, which gives Putin leverage he doesn't deserve. President Trump's doing the same thing. So I would say to President Trump, who I don't think wants to be like President Biden, like, don't be like President Biden. Listen to your own phrase of peace through strength. Look at the experience Reagan had, with the Soviet Union, which I think Will and Bowden's book, Reagan the Peacemaker, I highly recommend it. Reagan went in hard on the Soviet Union, and then got to a former détente, got to agreements like the INF Treaty, which eliminated a whole class of nuclear weapons. But he didn't do that by trying to accommodate the Soviet Union up front.
I'm sticking with the theme, if I may, because I do want to get to Ukraine in a moment. But you raise a really interesting point about the fundamental weaknesses of President Putin's regime and leadership and Russia writ large. Do you think we are thinking creatively enough in applying pressure, both carrots and incentives, to both drive a systemic change in the nature of the conflict in Ukraine, but also our relationship with Russia? Because it seems over recent history, we've fallen into a trap of tit for tat sort of behaviors. They do this, we'll expel some diplomats, we'll impose some sanctions, and that's about it. It's almost factored into the cost of Russian doing business. I think the political warfare gray zone operations are a great example. Very carefully calibrated below the threshold that they'll provoke some disagreement, some frustration, people being upset and unfortunately injured in this, but below the threshold that will provoke a response. So, from your perspective, obviously having been in the National Security Council, are we being creative enough in our tools to respond to Russia, but also
I
potentially
don't think
applying them to
so. And
China
this
as
is where
well?
I think, we could actually help in academia and and help think about, what are the mechanisms that authoritarian regimes use to control their populations. You have to remember, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, they're not afraid of the United States as much as they're afraid of their own people, right? And so Stephen Kotkin, who's a great scholar here and a colleague here at the Hoover Institution, he's an expert on authoritarian regimes, right? He's finishing the third volume of his biography of Stalin, and what he's identified are really five key elements of state control that authoritarian regimes use. The first of these is cash flow, right? They need cash flow, right? They need cash flow to feed their criminalized patronage networks, and they need cash flow for their second mechanism staying in control, which is to pay for security forces, often multiple security forces because you want to divide responsibility. You need watchers to watch the watchers, and to make sure you don't have disloyal groups like, the Wagner group who turned on Vladimir Putin and marched on Moscow, with a ragtag group that shot down 7 aircraft and had the Russians cratering, the roads in front of him. That's not a sign of strength, but the third thing that they need is they need control over life choices, right? If you want to start a business, if you want to go to university, if you want to go abroad, right? I mean, they control your life choices. The fourth thing they need are stories. They need stories to tell their people. I'm the only person who can save you from whatever it is, right? If you're Xi Jinping, it's encirclement and keeping the Chinese people down. If it's Putin, it's NATO's encirclement, or Ukrainian Nazis, for example, in a country that's led by a Russian-speaking Jewish president. I mean, but the stories are often ridiculous, but they play to people's fears and convince them that the leader and the party or this authoritarian regime is the only thing that can save them, right? If it's Iran, it's the Zionist crusader conspiracy against us and so forth. And then the final thing that they need is an international system that's at least benign to them, and allows them to operate and get away with it, essentially. So, if I were a national security advisor, again, I would convene the NSC and the NEC staffs, and of course their reach into the departments and agencies, and put together a planning effort on how to isolate authoritarian regimes from their sources of strength and support. And to do that, of course, with allies and partners, and to do it in kind of a systematic way, and to come up with measures of effectiveness, and adapt those strategies over time. And I think sadly, what we're doing is kind of the opposite of that. I mean, we're dismantling a lot of the mechanisms that we've had in place, from elements of U.S. aid, and I think there were elements of U.S. aid that needed to go, but not everything. And then a lot of our communications capabilities, abilities to go over and around these information firewalls that are really important for regimes' stories to their people to go unchallenged. So, it's sad. It's sad what we're doing. I think, in that we are delivering some victories, for self-inflicted victories for some of these authoritarian regimes that they don't deserve. And we ought to be working, I think, harder, to isolate them from these sources of strength and support.
Sticking with this, it's interesting that you bring up the USAID and Voice of America and Radio Free Europe conversations. It seems that I would love your thoughts on this, that the systems of governance that we have in the United States, the bureaucracy that exists, is almost a 20th century system that's attempting to respond to 21st century challenges, but using outdated approaches and thinking and methodology. I mean, the USAID had some great programs, but also had things that were less efficient and waste and whatnot. The same thing with Voice of America, and was not necessarily appropriate for the 21st century environment. So how would you look at
Right.
modernizing like these institutions, these systems to deliver those kind of effects that you're talking about, to go around the firewalls? Because I can't imagine that if putting myself in the shoes of a young Russian or a young Chinese citizen, that I'm going necessarily to Voice of America through the traditional website, for example. How do we sort of modernize those tools of political information warfare,
I think the
to
key is
adapt
to
to
is
these
to make sure
challenges?
that form follows function. I mean, come up with really clearly articulated goals and more specific objectives, objectives that will allow you to measure progress, and build the organization to pursue those objectives. And as you mentioned, there was a lot of like ridiculous programs. I mean, really like teaching journalists in Indonesia, how not to use gender charged language. I mean, come on, man. So I just think that what we really need is rigor, and as you mentioned, applying kind of the newer technologies, right? And so, what objectives would you have in mind? I mean, I think it would be to ensure that people who live behind the firewalls of authoritarian regimes have access to alternative sources of information. That's an important objective. Lankoff, who's written this great book called The Real North Korea, in the conclusion of that book, he basically says that if there's ever going to be a resolution of tensions on the Korean Peninsula and an end to the Kim family regime, it's going to take helping the North Korean people get alternative sources of information to think differently about the world because they've been subjected to state-based systemic brainwashing, for decades, right? For generations. And so that's an example of using the kind of for the USIS old example, U.S. Information Service. I mean, we should have something like that, but of course, it also ought to be augmented by the private sector, and there are new technologies, obviously, to get around these firewalls. We ought to be employing those, um, and again, just making sure that any of our government agencies have to answer the question of whether or not they are advancing U.S. vital interests and if they're making progress toward their objectives, and it's possible to put, I think, programs, efforts, initiatives, operations together that are oriented on objectives and are measurable in terms of not just measuring like confusing activity with progress, like the old burn rate at USAID, like burn rate, like on money. I mean, what the hell are you talking about? Are you actually materially contributing to U.S. interests
Right.
and clearly defined objectives?
No, it's very interesting. It's kind of the idea of motion versus movement. I like your description there. One of the things that I took away most significantly from Battlegrounds was your idea and conception of strategic empathy, which I've gleefully stolen that and reused it in so many different places because I think it is a masterful articulation of one of the central challenges as I see it about our ability to understand the adversary, but also to develop policies and tools to affect the adversary either positively or negatively. I mean, from your perspective, I mean, do we have enough strategic empathy, be it with Russia, be it with Ukraine, be it with China, or be it with the North Koreans? And if we don't, how do we get more into the system? Because if we look at the CIA, the State Department, there's some unbelievably smart individuals who know the subject area inside and out. And then you have policymakers who are at the front end, the sharpest edge, dealing with these challenges. How do you bridge that gap in getting people to think, be it the president, be it the next president, be it whomever, to look across the aisle, or look across the table at President Putin and get a better sense of what he is thinking, or Xi
Well,
Jinping and
I
get a sense of
borrowed the
what he
term
is
strategic
thinking.
empathy from a fantastic historian named Zachary Shore. So I think step one would be read Zach Shore's book, A Sense of the Enemy, as well as a fantastic earlier book of his called Blunder: Why Smart People Make Bad Decisions. And we should be aware of the cognitive traps that we step into, that we fall into, and a way to avoid those traps is, as you mentioned, strategic empathy, which is paying attention in particular to the emotions and the ideology and the aspirations that drive and constrain the other. If we don't have that empathy and be able to view kind of the complex challenges we're facing from the perspective of the other, especially our adversaries, rivals, enemies, then we could actually engage in activities that are wasteful, or based on flawed assumptions, and actually advance the interests of our adversary. And we've done that in so many cases. I mean, just think about like what is the fundamental assumption that's underpinning our approach to Russia now? That Russia will cease its hostility to Europe, the United States, the West, Ukraine, if we can allay Putin's security concerns. Is that really a valid assumption? I don't think so. On China, that China having been welcomed into the international order would play by the rules, and as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. How's that assumption working out? It's not working out. Iran, look at what President Obama did for Iran in 2015 with the Iran nuclear deal and sanctions relief and big payoffs. What he thought is that maybe Iran would play a positive role in the region. Actually, the people in the Obama administration, they thought that. And actually, some of those same people came back into the Biden
Yeah.
administration and repeated the failures of the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. Is President Trump going to do the same thing for Vladimir Putin that President Obama did for Ayatollah Khamenei in 2015? I hope not, because if he does, again, it will be based on this lack of strategic empathy and what I call in the book Battleground strategic narcissism, the tendency to define the world only in relation to us and assume that what we do or choose not to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. Well, guess what, man? Hey, our adversaries, our enemies, they have authorship over the future too. So I think it's a profoundly arrogant view of the world to engage in this kind of narcissistic view. And what we need is a dose of humility and empathy, especially as we look at these problem sets from the perspective of the other.
I'm curious if we could apply a bit of that strategic empathy to certainly our allies and partners. There's been a significant amount of consternation, frustration, fear in response to the President Trump's certainly policies towards Russia, but also statements on Ukraine and Europe. President Duda of Poland is talking about getting American nuclear weapons in Poland. President Macron is hosting an emergency summit in Paris. You're talking about Ursula von der Leyen was coming out with Resilience 2030 or Readiness, 2030 today. Do we think we're understanding the impact of what's happening here in Washington in Europe sufficiently? And is there a risk that in the desire to get European independence and self-sufficiency, such as is possible on defense and security, that it goes too far
Yeah,
the other
there
way, that
there
there's an
has been an
overcorrection?
overcorrection already, I think. And I think that overcorrection is based on the frustration of many Americans who supported, President Trump in the election, and frustration by President Trump and the Vice President and others that Europe has been free riding on the largesse of American taxpayers in the area of security. So I think what's needed is some strategic empathy on the part of the Europeans directed toward us, right? And to understand why Americans are frustrated. I mean, Americans think that they have been actually paying for Europe's social programs, and their security net or the welfare states, whatever you want to call it, because we've been covering their defense so they can provide all these benefits to their populations at the expense of our taxpayers. That's how a lot of Americans are thinking about it. So the sooner Europe recognizes that, the sooner they can, continue on this path to take more actions. Now, if they try to say, "Hey, we're going to do strategic autonomy," it's not going to work for them. It's not going to work. What we really need to do is to re-anchor the transatlantic relationship. Where is that anchor going to land? Is it going to land in Mertz's Germany, like it used to be in many phases of the Cold War? But when we take a long view of this, Josh, we have to think, and you know this, better than I do, is that the NATO alliance has been failing since 1949. Right? There have been all these, there's been angst about it from the very beginning. So I think what we can do is just it's time to get over it.
Right.
The best outcome I can think of is now that Europe's gotten the memo, now that the Zeitenwende that was declared by Olaf Scholz really is acted on by Merz. You have a Labour government in the UK who's now going to invest more in defense and is talking about a coalition of the willing and committing troops to Ukraine maybe after a ceasefire or a peace deal of some kind. So that's all positive. It's negative though if there's a rending in the transatlantic relationship, a weakening of the transatlantic relationship. So I think we should stop being mean-spirited about it. With Europe, we should we should say, hey, okay, now let's talk about real burden sharing. I'm glad you're on the right path. We should make friends with Canada again. I just don't understand that at all, man. I mean, and what's missing is like a positive agenda, Josh. Okay, I mean, look at what President Trump wants to do. He wants to grow the economy. He wants to deregulate. He wants to apply new technologies and usher in a new era of, new industrial revolution, essentially. He wants energy security. Hey, man, that sounds like Europe's agenda to me. It sounds like the Draghi report to me. It sounds what former President of Finland Niinisto said at Chatham House. I mean, you know, let's form a positive agenda instead of getting in this kind of cycle of negativity, and I mean, Europe's realized, hey, you know, unfettered migration, is a problem. Okay, that's President Trump's agenda too, right? In the area of border security. I mean, there should be a hell of a lot more alignment than I've seen. Are we all worried about various forms of Chinese economic aggression in terms of, industrial espionage and overcapacity and dumping of EVs and solar panels and wind turbines and batteries? Yeah, we're worried about that together. So let's work on these problems together, right? And there'll still be issues, right, between unfair, or unequal access to markets, which the president is worried about with the EU. But we can resolve those, man. We can resolve those, right? We had issues with Japan. The Trump's first term, we had a new trade agreement. We
Mhm.
we renegotiated Chorus, we renegotiated USMCA, right? So, okay, let's just get after it and establish a positive agenda, right? I mean, I feel like remember the character Oddball? Go back to Tanks here, in Kelly's Heroes, and he says, "Enough with the negative waves, Moriarty. Enough with the negative waves."
Lieutenant General McMaster, I think unfortunately that's probably we're going to have to stop just to be respectful of your time. I think the hallmark of a great conversation is that they can continue to go over, and you want to have several more thereafter. So, would be honored to have you back again for part two and part three, to say the least. Um, but so on that note, I was thinking it's going to bring unfortunately this episode to a close. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you as always to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI staff and helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts, and will be also available on YouTube and NSI's webpage. Make sure you stay tuned for updates about our next season and other special episodes, which hopefully will include another conversation with General McMaster if we're very lucky. As always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And General McMaster, thank you so much for an
Hey,
absolutely
Joshua, thanks,
fantastic
man. With what's
conversation.
going on in the world today, you might need something stronger than coffee, though.
Well, I will happily provide if you're willing to join. We can call it Scotch and
Hey, great to be
conversation. How
with you.
about that?
Thanks.